I fell for my 20-year-old stepson, and Lord help me, I let him take me to places I ain't never been before, body and soul, thinking it was love when it was nothing but the cruelest kind of trap a woman my age could fall into. My name is Calico Evans, and I'm 83 years old now, sitting here on my front porch in Fossil, Oregon, where the Douglas firs stand tall like sentinels keeping our secrets. To anyone driving down Sycamore Drive, I'm just another old widow with too many cats and a garden that still wins ribbons at the county fair. The mailman waves. The preacher's wife brings me casseroles when she thinks I'm looking too thin. And the children next door call me Grandma Calico, like I was born to be everyone's sweet old grandmother. They see my white hair pinned neat, my Sunday dresses pressed crisp, my hands that shake just a little when I pour the sweet tea on hot afternoons like this one. But Fossil, Oregon has always been the kind of place where the morning fog rolls in thick enough to hide what shouldn't be seen, where the timber trucks rumble past our little houses carrying secrets as heavy as the logs they haul. The church bells ring every Sunday morning, calling folks to worship and forgiveness. But some sins feel too heavy for even those old wooden pews to hold. The air here smells like pine needles and coffee from Mabel's Diner, where the old men gather to solve the world's problems over biscuits and gravy, never knowing that one of their neighbors has been living with shame, heavier than the winter snow that blankets our rooftops. I'm fixing to tell you the whole truth about what happened in this house after my Samuel passed, because carrying this secret has about worn me down to nothing. What started as grief and loneliness turned into something so twisted and shameful that I've been afraid to even whisper it to God in my prayers. Though I know He sees everything anyway. I need to tell someone before I take my last breath, because the weight of keeping quiet is killing me slower than old age ever could. You're about to hear something that'll make you question everything you think you know about love, about family, about how far a lonely heart can fall when it's desperate enough. And I'm asking you to stay with me through this story, even when it gets ugly, even when you want to turn away, because sometimes the only way out of hell is to walk all the way through it and come out the other side. When Samuel died on a Tuesday morning in February, the snow was falling so thick you couldn't see past the mailbox, and I swear that storm felt like God Himself was weeping for what was about to happen to me. My husband of 37 years just slipped away in his sleep, peaceful as you please, leaving me in this big old house with nothing but the sound of the furnace kicking on and off, and the memories hanging in every corner like cobwebs I couldn't bring myself to sweep away. Samuel had been my whole world since I was barely 18, when he swept me off my feet at a church social with his easy smile and hands that knew how to fix anything broken. We never did have children of our own. The Lord never blessed us that way. But Samuel had Jasper from his first marriage, back when he was just a boy I barely knew. That first wife of his, Margaret. She was bitter as green persimmons even then, always making it clear that I was just the second choice, the replacement wife who'd never measure up. When she took Jasper and moved clear across the state after their divorce, Samuel used to get letters maybe twice a year, but the boy might as well have been a stranger. Those first months after the funeral, I wandered through this house like a ghost myself, talking to Samuel's empty coffee cup and sleeping on just my side of the bed, because his side still smelled like Old Spice and the dreams we used to share. The ladies from church brought enough casseroles to feed Sherman's army, but food tastes like sawdust when you're eating it alone. I started leaving the radio on all day just to hear human voices, because the silence was so heavy, it felt like being buried alive. That's when Jasper showed up. I hadn't seen that boy since he was maybe 14, all knobby knees and sullen looks. But here he was, 20 years old and standing on my doorstep with a duffel bag and eyes red from crying, saying he'd heard about his daddy and wanted to pay his respects. He'd grown into his daddy's height, but had his mama's sharp cheekbones, and when he wrapped his arms around me there on the porch, I felt something crack open in my chest that had been frozen solid since Samuel passed. "I know we don't really know each other, Calico," he said, and his voice was deep like Samuel's, but softer. "But I was hoping maybe I could stay a few days, help you with whatever needs doing around here. Daddy always said you were the best thing that ever happened to him. Now I should have known better. I should have listened to that little voice in my head that whispered warnings, should have paid attention to how his eyes darted around when he talked. Should have wondered why a boy who'd barely kept in touch suddenly wanted to play the grieving son. But grief makes you stupid. Makes you grab onto any scrap of comfort like a drowning woman clutching driftwood. And Jasper, he had his daddy's way of making you feel like you were the only person in the world that mattered. He moved into the spare room that very night, and I won't lie. It felt good to hear footsteps in the hallway again, to cook for someone besides myself, to have a reason to get out of my nightgown before noon. He fixed the squeaky hinge on the back door that had been driving me crazy for months, chopped wood for the fireplace without me even asking, and sat with me in the evenings reading aloud from Samuel's old westerns, because my eyes weren't what they used to be. But there was something else, too. Something I was too ashamed to admit, even to myself at first. The way he'd brush his hand across my shoulders when he brought me my morning coffee. How he'd sit just a little too close on the couch. Close enough that I could smell his soap and feel the warmth coming off his skin. The way he'd look at me sometimes. Like he was seeing something I didn't even know I was showing. I kept telling myself it was just loneliness playing tricks on my old mind. That I was imagining things that weren't there. But late at night, lying in that big empty bed, I'd find myself thinking about Jasper in ways that made my face burn with shame. At 83 years old, I thought I was long past such foolishness. Thought those kinds of feelings had dried up and blown away years ago like autumn leaves. 3 weeks after Jasper moved in, I was washing dishes after supper when he came up behind me and put his hands on my waist, just standing there quiet while I tried to keep my hands steady under the warm water. "You don't have to be alone anymore, Calico," he whispered against my ear. And I felt something inside me catch fire that I thought had died with Samuel. I should have stepped away. Should have told him to pack his bag and get on down the road. Should have remembered that I was old enough to be his grandmother. That he was my dead husband's son. That whatever was happening between us was wrong in ways I didn't even have words for. Instead, I leaned back against him and felt myself falling into something dark and hungry that I couldn't name. And that was when everything started coming apart at the seams. Though I wouldn't understand just how far I'd fallen until it was way too late to climb back out. The next morning I woke up feeling like I'd been caught in some kind of fever dream. My heart still racing from the memory of Jasper's hands on my waist, and the way his breath felt warm against my neck. I lay there in Samuel's old bed, staring at the water stain on the ceiling that looked like a map of somewhere I'd never been. Trying to convince myself that what happened in the kitchen was just two lonely people reaching out for comfort, and nothing more. But when I finally worked up the courage to go downstairs, there was Jasper standing at the stove making pancakes like nothing had changed, wearing one of Samuel's old flannel shirts that hung loose on his younger frame. He looked up when I shuffled in wearing my faded housecoat and gave me a smile that made my stomach flip like a schoolgirl's. And I knew right then that we'd crossed some kind of line that couldn't be uncrossed. "Morning, beautiful," he said. And the way he said it wasn't like talking to an old woman at all. It was the voice a man uses when he's looking at a woman he wants. And Lord help me, it had been so long since anyone looked at me that way, that I felt myself bloom under his attention, like a flower that had been waiting all winter for spring. Those first few days after, we danced around each other like two people afraid of touching a live wire. But the electricity was there crackling between us every time we passed in the hallway, or reached for the same dish at dinner. Jasper would find excuses to brush against me, steadying my elbow when I stepped off the porch, reaching around me to get a glass from the cabinet, letting his fingers linger when he handed me my coffee cup. And I started finding reasons to be close to him too, smoothing down his collar when he came in from chopping wood, standing right beside him when he showed me how to work the new coffee maker he'd bought to replace my old percolator. The house felt different with him in it, charged with something dangerous and sweet. Fossil had always been the kind of town where winter settles in like a long, cold blanket, where the pine trees stand so thick you can't see the sky some days. But suddenly everything seemed brighter. Even Mabel's diner down on Main Street, where the old-timers gathered to complain about the weather and the government, felt warmer when Jasper would drive me there for lunch and hold doors open like I was something precious. "You know what I love about you, Calico?" he said one afternoon as we sat in my living room. Him reading to me from one of Samuel's old Louis L'Amour novels, while the snow fell thick outside the windows. "You don't treat me like I'm just some kid. You listen when I talk. Really listen. Like what I have to say matters." I was mending one of his shirts, a tear he'd gotten from a loose nail in the barn. and my hands went still on the fabric. "Well, you're not a kid," I said. Though even as I said it, I knew 20 years old was young enough to be my grandson. "You're a grown man with your own thoughts and feelings." He set the book down and looked at me with those dark eyes that reminded me so much of Samuel's, but hungrier somehow, more desperate. Nobody's ever made me feel like that before. Not my mama, not the girls my age who just giggle and gossip about nothing. "You make me feel like I could be somebody important." The way he was looking at me made heat rise in my cheeks, and I had to concentrate on threading my needle to keep my hands from shaking. "Your daddy was important," I said. "You got his blood in you. That makes you important too." "I don't want to talk about him right now," Jasper said. And there was something sharp in his voice that made me look up. But when our eyes met, his expression softened again, and he reached over to take the shirt out of my hands. "I want to talk about you. About how you make me feel." Before I could stop him, he slid off the couch and knelt down beside my rocking chair, taking my weathered hands in his young, strong ones. "Calico, I know this is crazy. I know people wouldn't understand. But being here with you, taking care of you, it feels right in a way nothing else ever has." My heart was beating so fast I thought it might just give out right there in Samuel's old rocking chair. "Jasper, honey, you're confused. You're grieving your daddy, and I'm just an old woman who's been kind to you." "You're not old," he said fiercely, bringing my hands up to his lips and pressing soft kisses across my knuckles. "You're beautiful. You're alive in ways those young girls don't even know how to be yet. When I look at you, I see a woman who knows what she wants, who isn't afraid of real feelings." I should have pulled my hands away. Should have told him he was talking foolishness and sent him up to his room to think about what he was saying. But instead, I found myself stroking his cheek with my thumb, feeling the slight roughness of his jaw, and marveling at how soft his skin was compared to Samuel's had been. "You don't know what you're asking for," I whispered. "I know exactly what I'm asking for," he said. And then he was rising up from his knees, his face coming closer to mine, and I could smell the scent of him. Soap and wood smoke and something purely male that made my head spin. When he kissed me, it was gentle at first, tentative, like he was afraid I might break. But when I didn't pull away, when I found myself kissing him back with a hunger I didn't know I still possessed, he deepened it, and I felt something inside me that had been dormant for years suddenly roar back to life. We broke apart, breathing hard, and I could see my own shock reflected in his eyes. But underneath the shock was something else. A satisfaction. Like he'd just solved a puzzle he'd been working on for a long time. "There," he said softly, resting his forehead against mine. "Now you know I'm not confused about anything." That night, after we'd eaten a quiet dinner and said our goodnights like nothing had changed, I lay in my bed listening to him moving around in the room next door and wondering what kind of woman I was becoming. But for the first time since Samuel died, I didn't feel like I was drowning in loneliness. For the first time in months, I felt alive. I just didn't know yet that feeling alive was going to cost me everything I had left to lose. After that kiss in the living room, everything changed between us, though we both pretended for a few days that it hadn't. But pretending is like trying to hold back a river with your bare hands. Eventually, the water finds a way through. Jasper started bringing me little gifts. Nothing fancy. Just wildflowers he'd picked walking in the woods behind the house, or a smooth stone from the creek that caught his eye. He'd leave them on my nightstand, or tucked into the pages of my Bible. And every time I found one, I felt that flutter in my chest, like a girl getting notes passed in school. The weather turned warmer that week. One of those false springs Oregon gets sometimes in late February, where the snow melts and the air smells like mud and new growth and possibility. Jasper suggested we take walks after dinner, just around the neighborhood at first, him offering his arm when the sidewalk got icy, and me leaning into his strength more than I probably needed to. Mrs. Henderson from 3 houses down would wave from her kitchen window, and I'd wave back knowing she was probably already on the phone to her sister, wondering what Samuel's stepson was doing staying so long with the widow Evans. But I didn't care about Mrs. Henderson or anyone else's opinions right then. For the first time since Samuel passed, I had something to look forward to when I woke up in the mornings. Jasper would be there making coffee, humming some song under his breath. And when he smiled at me over his cup, I felt beautiful again. Not just tolerated or pitied like the other church ladies made me feel, but truly seen and wanted. Our walks got longer, stretching beyond the neighborhood and onto the old logging roads that wound through the timber behind town. Jasper knew these woods somehow, could point out deer trails and show me where the best huckleberries grew come summer. One afternoon, he led me to a clearing where someone had built a little shelter years ago. Just a lean-to, really. But it was private and peaceful with the sound of the creek running nearby. We sat on an old log that served as a bench, watching the water tumble over the rocks. And Jasper started telling me about his childhood. How his mama had filled his head with poison about Samuel, making him believe his daddy had abandoned them, when really Samuel had fought tooth and nail for visitation rights that Margaret kept finding ways to block. He talked about the loneliness of growing up thinking your own father didn't want you. And I found myself telling him about the loneliness of never having children at all. How Samuel and I had tried for years before accepting that some dreams just aren't meant to come true. When I started crying, remembering how much Samuel had wanted to be a real father to Jasper, the boy pulled me close and let me sob against his chest until his shirt was damp with my tears. His hand stroking my hair was so gentle, so patient, that I felt something shift inside me. Some wall I'd built around my heart starting to crumble. When I finally looked up at him, his face was so close I could see the gold flecks in his brown eyes. And this time when he kissed me, I didn't hesitate to kiss him back. But it was different this time. Hungrier, more desperate. His hands moved from my hair to my face, then down to my shoulders. And I could feel the want radiating off him like heat from a wood stove. When he pulled back, we were both breathing hard. And I could see something in his expression that was part desire and part something else I couldn't quite name. Relief, maybe. Or satisfaction. Like he'd just accomplished something he'd been planning for a long time. The walk home was quiet, but it was the kind of silence that hums with electricity. Every time our hands brushed, every time he steadied me over a rough patch of ground, I felt sparks shooting up my arm. By the time we reached the house, I was so keyed up I could barely sit still through dinner. Jasper seemed calm enough, chatting about maybe planting a garden come spring, but I caught him watching me when he thought I wasn't looking, and the intensity of his gaze made my stomach flip. That night, I lay in bed listening to him moving around in the next room, and found myself wondering what it would feel like to have those young, strong hands on more than just my shoulders. The thought made me feel ashamed and excited all at once. Like I was 17 again instead of 83, discovering feelings I thought were long dead and buried with my youth. I must have finally dozed off because I woke to the sound of my bedroom door creaking open. For a moment I thought maybe I was dreaming. But then I saw Jasper's silhouette in the doorway, tall and lean in just his pajama pants, and my heart started hammering so hard I was sure he could hear it. He didn't say anything. Just stood there for what felt like forever, and I held my breath wondering what he was thinking, what he was planning to do. Finally, he stepped into the room and walked over to where I lay frozen under Samuel's old quilt, and when he sat down on the edge of the bed, the mattress dipped under his weight. He reached out and touched my cheek so softly I might have imagined it, and when I didn't pull away, he leaned down and kissed my forehead like I was something precious and fragile. Then he whispered that he couldn't sleep, couldn't stop thinking about me, couldn't stand being so close but so far away, and would I mind if he just lay beside me for a while, just to feel less alone. Every sensible part of my brain was screaming that this was wrong, that I should send him back to his own room before we did something we couldn't take back. But the lonely part of me, the part that had been aching for human touch since Samuel died, was stronger than sense. I pulled back the covers and made room for him, and when he slid in beside me, fully clothed and careful not to touch more than necessary, I felt a peace I hadn't known I was missing. We just lay there in the dark, listening to each other breathe. But I could feel the tension building between us like steam in a kettle, and I knew, with a certainty that scared me more than anything else in my long life, that we were standing on the edge of something that would change everything forever. I just had no idea how far we were about to fall, or what would be waiting for us at the bottom. We didn't do anything that first night, just lay there in the dark, holding hands like teenagers. But it was the beginning of the end of my old life and the start of something I still don't have proper words for. The next morning, Jasper was back in his own room before I woke up, and we had breakfast like nothing had happened. But there was a new understanding between us, a shared secret that made every glance feel loaded with possibility. For 3 more days, we danced around what was building between us, him coming to my bed each night and leaving before dawn, both of us pretending we were just offering each other comfort in our grief. But comfort was turning into something hungrier, more dangerous. His hands would find mine under the covers. His body would press closer when he thought I was sleeping. And I'd lie there awake feeling like I was 17 again instead of 83, my whole body humming with feelings I thought were gone forever. On the 4th night, when he slipped into my room as he had before, I was sitting up waiting for him. The moonlight coming through the lace curtains Samuel's mother had made showed me his face clearly for the first time in the dark. And what I saw there wasn't just loneliness anymore. It was hunger. Pure and simple. The kind of want that makes a person do things they never thought they'd do. When he sat down on the bed beside me, I reached for him first this time, my old hands finding the warm skin of his chest through his unbuttoned shirt. He made a sound low in his throat, part surprise and part relief, like he'd been holding his breath for days waiting for me to give him some kind of permission, and maybe I'd been making him wait. Holding on to my last shreds of propriety, while my body screamed for his touch. What happened next still makes me blush to think about. Even now, Jasper's hands were so gentle, so patient, mapping every line and curve of my body like I was something precious instead of an old woman with skin like tissue paper and bones that creaked when I moved. He kissed me everywhere, whispering against my skin how beautiful I was, how long he'd wanted this, how right it felt to be with me this way. And Lord help me, it did feel right in that moment. Every touch sent fire racing through veins I thought had forgotten how to burn. When he moved over me, his young body covering mine, I felt more alive than I had in years. Like all the color had rushed back into a world that had been gray and empty since Samuel died. The way he looked at me, the way he said my name like it was a prayer, made me forget about everything else. The age difference, the family connection, the scandal it would cause if anyone found out. Afterwards, we lay tangled together in sheets that smelled like lavender and secrets. Jasper's head on my chest while I ran my fingers through his hair and tried to process what we'd just done. Part of me felt guilty, like I'd betrayed Samuel's memory by bringing another man into our bed. But a bigger part felt reborn, like I'd been sleepwalking through my life and finally woken up. Jasper lifted his head to look at me, his eyes bright in the moonlight. And he told me he loved me. Not like a stepmother, not like a friend or a caregiver, but like a woman he wanted to spend his life with. He said he'd been falling for me since the day he arrived, that everything about me drew him in. My strength, my kindness, the way I made him feel like he mattered. I should have been shocked by his declaration. Should have reminded him that love affairs between people our ages were the stuff of gossip and scandal. Instead, I found myself saying the words back to him, meaning them more than I'd meant anything in years. In that moment, lying skin to skin with Samuel's son, I believed we could make it work somehow. I believed love was enough to overcome any obstacle. But even as I was falling deeper under his spell, some small part of my mind registered things that didn't quite add up. The way his eyes sometimes went cold when he thought I wasn't looking. How he'd steer conversations away whenever I tried to ask about his life before he came to Fossil. The fact that he never seemed to have any money of his own, but always had cash when he needed it. One afternoon, about a week after we'd first made love, I was cleaning out Samuel's desk to donate his papers to the church when I found something that made my blood run cold. Hidden behind a stack of old tax returns was a letter from the Oregon Department of Corrections, dated just 2 months before Samuel died. It was addressed to Samuel Evans regarding his son, Jasper Evans, and the subject line read, "Notification of early release. Fraud conviction." My hands were shaking so hard I could barely read the details, but what I saw made my stomach drop like I'd swallowed a stone. Jasper had been in prison for fraud, specifically for scamming elderly women out of their savings by romancing them and gaining their trust. He'd been released early for good behavior just 6 weeks before showing up on my doorstep. I sat there in Samuel's old chair, staring at that letter and feeling like the world had tilted off its axis. Every tender moment, every passionate kiss, every whispered declaration of love suddenly looked different, tainted with calculation and deception. Had Jasper known Samuel was dying? Had he been waiting for the perfect moment to swoop in and take advantage of the grieving widow? But even with that letter burning in my hands like evidence of my own stupidity, I couldn't quite bring myself to believe it. The man who held me so tenderly, who made love to me with such apparent passion, couldn't be the same cold criminal described in that official document. There had to be some explanation, some misunderstanding. That night when Jasper came to my bed as he had every night for a week, I said nothing about the letter. Instead, I gave myself to him again, searching his face in the moonlight for any sign of deception, any hint that his feelings weren't real. But he seemed as tender as ever, as desperate for my touch. And by morning, I'd almost convinced myself that I was overreacting, that the letter was about some misunderstanding that had nothing to do with the man I was falling in love with. It would be 2 more weeks before I discovered just how wrong I was, and by then it would be far too late to protect myself from the trap I'd walked into with my eyes wide open. After finding that letter, everything changed for me, even though I tried my hardest to pretend it hadn't. I'd wake up in Jasper's arms feeling like the luckiest woman alive, then remember that piece of paper hidden in Samuel's desk, and feel sick to my stomach. It was like living in 2 different worlds at the same time. One where I was a woman experiencing love and passion I'd never dreamed possible, and another where I was just another mark in some elaborate con game. The doubt started eating at me like cancer, making me second-guess every sweet word, every tender touch. When Jasper would bring me coffee in bed and kiss my forehead, I'd find myself wondering if he was calculating how much longer he'd need to keep up the act. When he'd hold me close during our walks and tell me how much I meant to him, I'd study his face for signs that he was lying, though I never found any. The worst part was how good he was at making me feel loved, even knowing what I knew, or thought I knew. I couldn't help but respond to his touch, couldn't help but melt when he whispered my name in the dark. My body had awakened to pleasures I'd thought were long past, and Jasper seemed to know exactly how to play it like an instrument he'd been practicing on his whole life. But there were other things starting to bother me too, little details that my lovesick brain had been ignoring, like how he never seemed to have much money but always managed to buy little gifts. Flowers from the florist, a bottle of wine for dinner, a pretty scarf, he said reminded him of my eyes. When I asked where he got the cash, he'd just smile and say he'd been saving up from odd jobs. But I never saw him working anywhere around town. Then there was the way he'd tense up whenever anyone mentioned his past. Mrs. Henderson had stopped by one afternoon with a casserole and started asking Jasper the usual neighborly questions. Where he'd been living before, what kind of work he did, if he was planning to stay in Fossil long term. I watched his whole body go rigid, though he kept smiling and gave vague answers that didn't really answer anything at all. After she left, I tried to bring it up gently, telling him he didn't need to be shy about his past with me, that I'd love to hear more about his life before he came here. But he just pulled me into his arms and started kissing my neck, distracting me with the kind of passion that made my knees weak and my questions disappear like smoke. It was becoming a pattern. Whenever I got too close to topics he didn't want to discuss, Jasper would turn on the charm, make love to me until I forgot what I'd been worried about. At the time, I thought it was just his way of showing me that the present was more important than the past. Now I understand it was something much more calculated. About 10 days after I found the letter, I was grocery shopping at Miller's Market when I overheard Doris Hartwell talking to the butcher about strange cars being seen parked down by the old logging road at odd hours. She was speculating about drug dealers or teenagers using it as a makeout spot, but something about her description made my stomach clench. A dark blue sedan, she said, with out-of-state plates, seen there several times in the past few weeks. That night, I couldn't sleep. Jasper was breathing peacefully beside me, one arm thrown across my waist, but I kept thinking about that blue car. Around 3 a.m, I eased out of bed and went to the window that looked out toward the road. The moon was bright enough that I could see our driveway clearly, and my heart nearly stopped when I spotted a car parked in the shadows about 100 yards down the street. I stood there watching for nearly an hour, but the car never moved. When I finally went back to bed, Jasper stirred and asked if I was all right. I told him I'd just been getting a drink of water, but I could feel his eyes on me in the dark, studying me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. The next morning, I made an excuse about needing to visit Sarah Mackenzie, an old friend who lived clear across town, just to see if Jasper would want to come along, or if he'd prefer to stay home. He chose to stay, saying he wanted to work on fixing the loose boards on the back steps. And I spent the entire drive to Sarah's, wondering what he was really planning to do while I was gone. Sarah had been my friend for over 40 years, one of the few people in town who'd known me since before I married Samuel. And she took one look at my face and knew something was wrong. Over coffee and store-bought cookies, I found myself telling her about Jasper's arrival, though I left out the more intimate details. I just said he'd been staying to help out, and that I was starting to have doubts about his motives. Sarah listened without interrupting, but when I finished, she reached across the table and took my hands in hers. She told me she'd been hearing whispers around town about me and my houseguest. Nothing malicious. Just people wondering if it was appropriate for a young man to be staying with a widow woman for so long. She said most folks figured I was just being kind to Samuel's boy, but there were a few who thought it looked strange. But then she said something that chilled me to the bone. Her nephew worked for the county sheriff's department, and he'd mentioned that they'd had inquiries recently about running background checks on people, specifically requests that seemed to be coming from private investigators or lawyers. When I asked what that might mean, Sarah just shrugged and said it could be anything. Insurance investigations, custody disputes, inheritance issues. I drove home with my heart pounding, trying to convince myself that Sarah's nephew's information had nothing to do with me or Jasper. But when I pulled into the driveway and saw that the back steps looked exactly the same as when I'd left, I knew Jasper had been lying about his plans for the day. That night, he made love to me with an urgency that felt almost desperate, like he was trying to brand himself onto my memory. And when he held me afterwards, whispering about how much he loved me, and how he never wanted to be apart from me, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was saying goodbye. I just didn't know yet that goodbye was the last thing on his mind. The next few days passed in a blur of forced normalcy, me trying to act like everything was fine while my nerves felt like live wires under my skin. Jasper seemed different too, more attentive if that was possible. Bringing me breakfast in bed, running baths for me in the evenings, constantly touching me and telling me how beautiful I was. It should have felt romantic, but instead it felt like he was trying to keep me distracted from something. Like a magician using one hand to dazzle you while the other picks your pocket. I started paying closer attention to his habits, the way he'd disappear for hours at a time, claiming he was just walking in the woods. How he'd take phone calls out on the porch, where I couldn't hear what he was saying. One morning, I pretended to be napping after he brought me coffee, and through half-closed eyes, I watched him go through my purse, carefully examining my checkbook and credit cards, before putting everything back exactly where he'd found it. The realization hit me like a slap. He wasn't just studying my financial situation out of casual curiosity. He was cataloging what I had, learning the details of my accounts, figuring out exactly how much Samuel had left me. The inheritance wasn't huge by city standards, but in a town like Fossil it was enough to live comfortably for the rest of my days. Enough, I was starting to realize, to make me a very attractive target for someone like Jasper. But even with suspicion growing in my chest like a tumor, I couldn't bring myself to confront him directly. Part of me was still desperately hoping I was wrong, that the man who made love to me so tenderly couldn't possibly be the same person who'd gone to prison for fraud. And part of me was just plain scared. Scared of being alone again. Scared of admitting I'd been such a fool. Scared of what Jasper might do if he knew I was onto him. That fear got a lot stronger the day I found the gun. I'd been doing laundry, something Jasper usually insisted on handling himself, but he'd gone into town for supplies, and I was bored. When I picked up his duffel bag to check the pockets before washing his jeans, I felt something heavy wrapped in a t-shirt at the bottom. My hands were shaking as I unwrapped it, but there was no mistaking what I was holding. A black pistol. Small but deadly looking, with the serial numbers filed off. I stood there in my laundry room, holding that gun, and feeling like my whole world had shifted off its axis. Why would Jasper need a weapon? What was he planning to do with it? The questions spinning through my head all led to the same terrifying conclusion. I wasn't just being conned. I was in real danger. I wrapped the gun back up and put it exactly where I'd found it, but I couldn't stop my hands from trembling for the rest of the day. When Jasper came home with groceries and a bouquet of daisies, kissing me like he'd missed me terribly in the few hours he'd been gone, I had to excuse myself to the bathroom to throw up. The tenderness that had made me feel so alive now felt like a mask hiding something monstrous. That night, when he reached for me in bed, I made an excuse about not feeling well, claiming I might be coming down with something. He was understanding, even made me tea with honey and sat with me until I pretended to fall asleep. But I lay there wide awake, listening to him breathing beside me and wondering if he was planning to use that gun on me. If all this elaborate seduction was just a way to get close enough to make my death look like an accident, or a robbery gone wrong. The next morning brought a new horror I hadn't seen coming. I was checking the mail when I saw a car I didn't recognize parked across the street. A woman sitting behind the wheel talking on her phone. She was maybe 50, with graying hair and hard eyes, and something about her looked familiar in a way that made my stomach clench. When she saw me looking, she got out of the car and walked over with the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes. She introduced herself as Margaret Evans, Jasper's mother, and said she'd driven over from Portland because she was worried about her son. She'd heard he was staying with me and wanted to make sure I understood what kind of man I was dealing with. Standing there on my own front porch, listening to this bitter woman who'd been Samuel's first wife, I felt like I was in some kind of nightmare. Margaret told me things about Jasper that made my blood run cold. How he'd been in and out of trouble since he was a teenager. How he specialized in targeting lonely older women. How his last victim had been a widow in Eugene, who'd lost her life savings before her family intervened. But the worst part was when she pulled out her phone and showed me a news article from the Eugene Register Guard. There was Jasper's picture, younger but unmistakably him, next to the headline, "Local Man Arrested in Elder Fraud Scheme." The article described how he'd romanced several elderly women, gained their trust, and systematically drained their accounts before disappearing. Margaret watched my face as I read, and I could see the satisfaction in her eyes as she watched my world crumble. She told me she knew exactly what Jasper was doing to me, that she'd been waiting for him to make his move, so she could stop him before he destroyed another family. She said she had investigators watching my house, documenting everything, building a case that would put Jasper away for a long time. When I asked why she cared what happened to me, her smile turned cruel. She said it wasn't about me at all. It was about making sure Jasper paid for ruining her life all those years ago, for being the reason Samuel divorced her in the first place. She blamed Jasper for everything that had gone wrong in her marriage, even though he'd just been a child caught in the middle of adult problems. Before she left, Margaret handed me a business card for a private investigator and told me to call him when I was ready to help them gather evidence. She said they already had enough to arrest Jasper, but they wanted to build an airtight case, and my testimony about how he'd seduced and manipulated me would be crucial. I watched her drive away feeling like I'd been hit by a truck. Everything I thought I knew about my life, about Jasper, about the love I thought we shared, was built on lies. But even worse than the betrayal was the realization that I was trapped in the middle of some twisted family drama that had nothing to do with me and everything to do with old grudges and revenge. That evening, when Jasper came home with Chinese takeout and wine, acting like we were just a normal couple having a romantic dinner, I could barely look at him. But I played along, smiling and making conversation while inside I was screaming, because now I knew the truth. I wasn't Jasper's lover. I was his victim, and I was starting to suspect that the gun in his bag wasn't meant for robbery. It was meant for me. After Margaret's visit, I felt like I was living in a house made of glass, waiting for someone to throw the first stone. Every smile Jasper gave me felt like a lie. Every touch felt like manipulation. But I was trapped in this horrible performance where I had to keep pretending everything was normal while my world crumbled around me. The worst part was that my body still responded to him. Still craved his touch even though my mind knew he was dangerous. It felt like being addicted to poison. I started paying attention to things I'd been too lovesick to notice before, like how Jasper would get phone calls that made him step outside, speaking in low, urgent tones to someone he never mentioned to me, how he'd started asking casual questions about my banking habits, whether I preferred to handle money matters in person or over the phone, if I'd ever considered updating my will now that Samuel was gone. 3 days after meeting Margaret, I was dusting in the living room when I found something that made my blood freeze. Tucked behind Samuel's old photo albums was a manila folder I'd never seen before, filled with papers that had my name all over them, bank statements I hadn't requested, copies of insurance policies I didn't remember sharing, even a photocopy of my social security card that I kept locked in Samuel's safe. My hands were shaking as I flipped through page after page of my personal information that could only have been gathered by someone with access to my house, my papers, my trust. At the bottom of the stack was something that made me nearly faint. A blank power of attorney form with my name already typed in, just waiting for a signature that would give Jasper complete control over my finances. I heard his truck pulling into the driveway and quickly shoved everything back where I'd found it, my heart hammering so hard I thought it might burst. When he came through the door carrying flowers and humming some tune under his breath, I had to run to the bathroom to keep from being sick. The man I'd been sleeping with, the man I'd thought loved me, had been systematically preparing to steal everything I had. That night, when he reached for me in bed, I couldn't hide my revulsion anymore. When he asked what was wrong, I made up some story about feeling sick, about maybe needing to see a doctor. His concern seemed so genuine, his hands so gentle as he felt my forehead for fever, that for a moment I almost believed I was going crazy, that maybe Margaret had been lying, that maybe there was some innocent explanation for everything. But then he suggested I might want to think about making some changes to my financial arrangements, just in case something happened to me while I wasn't feeling well. He said it so casually, like he was discussing the weather, but the way his eyes watched my face told me everything I needed to know. He was testing me, seeing if I was ready to sign away my independence. The next morning, Jasper left early, saying he had errands to run in town. As soon as his truck disappeared down the road, I called the number Margaret had given me. The private investigator, a man named Tom Crawford, had been waiting for my call. He told me they'd been building a case against Jasper for months, that I wasn't his first victim since getting out of prison, just the most recent. Tom explained that Jasper had a pattern. He'd target isolated older women, usually widows with significant assets, seduce them into thinking they were in love, then systematically drain their accounts before disappearing. The Eugene woman Margaret had mentioned wasn't his only victim. There had been 3 others in the past year alone, women who'd been too ashamed to come forward until investigators tracked them down. But what Tom told me next made my blood run cold. The woman before me, a widow named Helen Grayson from Bend, had been found dead in her home 2 weeks after she'd started asking questions about money missing from her accounts. The official cause of death was listed as a heart attack, but Helen's daughter had pushed for an autopsy that revealed traces of digitalis in her system, a heart medication that Helen had never been prescribed. Tom said they couldn't prove Jasper had killed Helen, but the timing was suspicious, and they'd found evidence that he'd been in Bend around the time of her death. He told me I needed to be very careful, that if Jasper suspected I knew about his past, I could be in real danger. He wanted me to wear a wire, to try to get Jasper to confess to something they could use in court. The idea of deliberately provoking a man who might have already killed someone terrified me, but Tom made it clear that I was probably in danger whether I helped them or not. If Jasper was planning to kill me, my best chance of survival was to help them gather enough evidence to arrest him before he could act. That afternoon, while I waited for Jasper to come home, I sat in Samuel's old rocking chair trying to process everything I'd learned. The man I'd fallen in love with didn't exist. He was just a character Jasper played, a mask worn by a predator who saw me as nothing more than a bank account with a pulse. Every tender moment, every passionate kiss, every whispered word of love had been carefully calculated to make me vulnerable. But the worst part was realizing how easily I'd fallen for it all. I'd been so desperate for love, so hungry for companionship, that I'd ignored every red flag, explained away every inconsistency. I'd let loneliness make me stupid, and now I was paying the price for my foolishness. When Jasper came home that evening, he was carrying a bottle of champagne and wearing a smile that would have melted my heart just a week ago. He said he had something special to tell me, Something that would change our lives, forever. My blood turned to ice as I realized what was coming. He was going to propose. Not out of love, but as the final step in his plan to gain complete control over my money. As he knelt down beside my chair, pulling out a ring that probably came from some pawn shop, I felt like I was watching my own execution. But I smiled and let him slip that cheap band onto my finger. Let him kiss me while he talked about our future together. All the while knowing that if Tom Crawford was right, Jasper wasn't planning for us to have a future at all. He was planning for me to die. And soon, just like Helen Grayson had died when she got too close to the truth, the engagement ring felt like a shackle on my finger, cold and heavy with the weight of Jasper's lies. He wanted to celebrate with that champagne, wanted to make love to his newly betrothed bride. But I begged off claiming exhaustion, saying the proposal had been such a wonderful surprise that I needed time to process it all. The truth was, I couldn't bear the thought of his hands on me knowing what I now knew. Couldn't stand the idea of him touching me while planning my death. That night, I lay awake listening to him breathe beside me and thinking about Helen Grayson, wondering if she'd spent her last nights like this, trapped in bed next to her killer, pretending to sleep while terror ate her alive from the inside. I found myself studying Jasper's profile in the moonlight, trying to see the monster underneath the handsome mask. But even knowing what he was, he still looked like the man who'd made me feel beautiful again. The next morning brought a new horror I hadn't expected. Jasper suggested we drive into Portland to pick out a proper engagement ring. Something worthy of our love, he said. But I knew what he was really doing. Getting me away from Fossil, away from anyone who might notice if I disappeared. The thought of being alone with him in a strange city, hours from help, made my stomach clench with fear. I made excuses about not feeling well enough for such a long drive. But Jasper was persistent, almost aggressive about it in a way I'd never seen before. When I finally convinced him to postpone the trip, I caught something in his expression that chilled me. A flash of anger, quickly hidden, but real enough to remind me that underneath all his charm was something cold and calculating. Tom Crawford had given me a small recording device, no bigger than a button, that I was supposed to pin inside my blouse. The plan was for me to try to get Jasper talking about his past, about the other women, anything that might be useful in court. But every time I tried to bring up the subject, he'd change topics or distract me with kisses, like he had some sixth sense about dangerous conversations. 3 days after the proposal, I was folding laundry when I found something in Jasper's pants pocket that made my knees give out. It was a small glass vial, nearly empty, with a pharmacy label that had been partially torn off. I could just make out part of the drug name, something ending in Oxin, and a prescription number that didn't match anything in my medicine cabinet. I stood there in my laundry room, holding that vial and remembering what Tom had told me about Helen Grayson and the digitalis in her system. My hands were shaking so badly I nearly dropped it, but I managed to put it back exactly where I'd found it, knowing now that Jasper wasn't just planning to rob me. He was planning to poison me, probably slowly, making it look like my old heart had finally given out from the excitement of a whirlwind romance. That afternoon, while Jasper was out getting groceries, I called Tom Crawford from the phone in Samuel's study, whispering even though I knew I was alone in the house. When I told him about the vial, the silence on the other end of the line was so long, I thought we'd been disconnected. Finally, Tom told me they needed to move faster than planned. He said they had enough evidence to arrest Jasper on the fraud charges, but they needed something that would stick for Helen's murder. He wanted me to confront Jasper directly about the vial, to wear the wire, and try to get him to confess. When I protested that it was too dangerous, Tom's voice got hard. He said if I didn't help them now, I'd probably be dead within the week, and they'd be investigating my murder instead of preventing it. The weight of that settled on me like a lead blanket. I was 83 years old, trapped in my own home with a man who'd already killed at least once. And my only hope of survival was to deliberately provoke him into admitting it. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd spent my whole life avoiding confrontation, trying to keep peace, and now my life depended on starting the biggest fight of my existence. That evening, Jasper cooked dinner for us, something he'd been doing more often lately. As I watched him move around my kitchen, seasoning the food and humming contentedly, I found myself wondering if he'd already started poisoning me. Had he been putting small amounts of something in my coffee, my tea, gradually weakening my heart for the final dose that would kill me? Every bite of dinner tasted like sawdust, every sip of wine like potential death. But I forced myself to eat, to smile, to act like a woman madly in love with her younger fiancé. When Jasper reached across the table to take my hand, telling me how happy I made him, how he couldn't wait to spend the rest of our lives together, I had to bite my tongue to keep from screaming. After dinner, he suggested we take a walk down to the creek, just the two of us under the stars. It was the kind of romantic gesture that would have melted my heart a week ago. But now it felt like an invitation to my own execution. The creek was isolated, far from any neighbors who might hear me scream. If he was planning to kill me tonight, it would be the perfect place. But I couldn't say no without making him suspicious. So I let him help me into my coat and lead me out into the cool evening air. The recording device Tom had given me was pinned inside my blouse, feeling as heavy as a stone against my chest. As we walked hand in hand down the familiar path, I tried to work up the courage to confront him, to ask the questions that might save my life or end it. The moon was full, casting everything in silver light that made the ordinary world look strange and threatening. When we reached the creek, Jasper pulled me close and kissed me under the stars, his hands gentle on my face, his voice soft as he told me again how much he loved me. And standing there in his arms, feeling his heart beat against mine, I almost lost my nerve, because even knowing what he was, even knowing what he'd done, part of me still wanted to believe the lies. Part of me still craved the illusion of being loved, even if that love was going to kill me. But then I remembered Helen Grayson and the other women Jasper had destroyed, and I knew I had to find the strength to fight back. Whatever happened next, I couldn't let him add another victim to his list. I just prayed I'd live long enough to see justice done. Standing there by the creek with Jasper's arms around me, I made the hardest decision of my 83 years. I was going to confront him, right there under the stars where no one could hear us. And whatever happened next would determine whether I lived to see another sunrise. The recording device felt like it was burning through my blouse, a reminder that this might be my only chance to get the truth on tape before he killed me. I pulled back from his embrace and looked into those dark eyes that had fooled me so completely, trying to find the courage to speak. When I finally opened my mouth, my voice came out steadier than I'd expected. Maybe because I'd spent so many years hiding my real feelings that pretending had become second nature. I told him I'd been having some health concerns lately, that I'd been thinking about updating my will and making sure my affairs were in order. I watched his face carefully as I spoke, looking for any sign that he knew where this conversation was headed. He seemed genuinely concerned, asking if I'd seen a doctor, offering to drive me to appointments, playing the devoted fiancé so perfectly that I almost believed him myself. But then I mentioned that I'd been going through Samuel's old papers, organizing things, and I saw something flicker in his expression. Just for a second, his mask slipped, and I caught a glimpse of the calculating predator underneath. When I told him I'd found some confusing documents with my name on them, papers I didn't remember signing, his whole body went tense. He recovered quickly, suggesting that maybe Samuel had been preparing some financial arrangements before he died. Things he hadn't had time to discuss with me, but I could hear the strain in his voice now, the careful way he was choosing his words. When I pressed him about whether he knew anything about these documents, whether he'd seen them while he was helping me organize, the silence stretched between us like a tightrope. Finally, Jasper's demeanor shifted completely. The gentle lover disappeared, replaced by someone cold and calculating. He told me I was asking a lot of questions for someone who should be focusing on our future together. There was a threat buried in his tone, subtle, but unmistakable. And I felt that little vial of poison burning in my memory like evidence of what he was capable of. I knew I was walking into dangerous territory, but I had to keep pushing. I told him I'd been having strange dreams lately. Dreams about other women, older women who'd been hurt by men they trusted. I said the dreams felt so real, like warnings from beyond the grave. As I spoke, I watched Jasper's face grow darker, his jaw clenching with barely controlled anger. When I mentioned Helen Grayson's name, Just dropped it casually into the conversation like I was talking about an old friend. Jasper went completely still. For a moment, the only sound was the creek bubbling over the rocks, and my own heart hammering against my ribs. Then he asked how I knew that name. His voice so quiet and dangerous that every instinct I had screamed at me to run, but there was nowhere to run to. And even if there had been, my old legs wouldn't have carried me far. So I stood my ground and told him the truth. That Margaret had visited, that private investigators had been watching him, that I knew about the other women he'd hurt. With each word, I watched him transform before my eyes, the mask of the loving stepson falling away completely to reveal the predator he'd always been. Jasper's reaction was swift and terrifying. He grabbed my arms hard enough to bruise, his fingers digging into my flesh as he pulled me close. His voice was a low growl as he told me I'd made a very serious mistake, that I should have minded my own business and been grateful for the love he'd shown me. The way he said love made it sound like a curse word, something dirty and shameful. But then something unexpected happened. Instead of the fear I'd been carrying for days, I felt a surge of pure rage unlike anything I'd ever experienced. This man had violated my home, my body, my trust in the most intimate way possible. He'd made me believe I was loved when I was just being hunted. He'd turned my grief into a weapon against me, used my loneliness to manipulate me into signing my own death warrant. I looked him straight in the eye and told him I knew exactly what he was. Exactly what he'd done to Helen and the others. I told him about the vial in his pocket, about the power of attorney forms, about every piece of evidence the investigators had gathered. With each revelation, I watched his control slip further, his mask cracking like ice in the spring. When I finished talking, Jasper was breathing hard, his hands still gripping my arms like vices. For a long moment, we just stared at each other in the moonlight. Predator and prey locked in a final confrontation. Then he started laughing, a sound so cold and empty it made my blood freeze. He told me I was right about everything, that I'd figured it all out just like Helen had. He said I should be proud of myself for being so clever, so observant. But then his voice turned deadly serious as he explained that being right wasn't going to save me. That in fact, it had just sealed my fate. He said he'd been planning to make my death look natural, peaceful even. But now he'd have to be more creative. As he spoke, I realized the recording device was getting everything. Every word of his confession. Every detail of his crimes. If I could somehow survive this night, if I could get this evidence to Tom Crawford, Jasper would never hurt another woman again. But survival was looking less and less likely with each passing second. Jasper's grip on my arms tightened as he told me we were going to walk back to the house now, that I was going to have a tragic accident, probably a fall down the stairs that would break my old bones beyond repair. He said if I tried to scream or run, he'd make it much worse for me, that he had ways of making death last for hours instead of minutes. But as we started walking back toward the house, my mind was racing, trying to think of some way to escape, some way to survive long enough to see justice done. I thought about Samuel, about how he'd want me to fight, about how he'd never forgive me if I let his son destroy everything we'd built together. And that's when I remembered something that might just save my life, if I was brave enough to use it. As we walked back toward the house, Jasper's grip on my arm like a steel trap, I remembered something that sent a surge of hope through my terror-frozen veins. Samuel's old hunting rifle, the one he'd kept loaded in the bedroom closet for protection, hidden behind his winter coats where I'd forgotten about it until this very moment. If I could somehow get to it before Jasper carried out his plan to push me down the stairs, I might have a chance. The house loomed ahead of us in the moonlight, every window dark except for the porch light that cast long shadows across the yard. Jasper was breathing hard beside me, his excitement at finally dropping the pretense making him careless. He started talking, maybe needing to boast about how clever he'd been, how easily I'd fallen for his act. He told me about the other women, about how pathetically grateful they'd all been for his attention, how simple it had been to make them sign over their assets before their tragic accidents. When he described Helen Grayson's final moments, how she'd begged him to call 911 as the poison stopped her heart, I felt such rage that I could barely see straight. This monster had taken advantage of women like me, Women who'd lost their husbands and were vulnerable in their grief, turning our loneliness into a weapon against us. He'd made us complicit in our own destruction by making us believe we were loved. We reached the front porch, and Jasper paused, probably planning the best way to stage my accident. That's when I made my move, pretending to stumble on the steps and crying out that I'd twisted my ankle. When he loosened his grip to catch me, I wrenched away and ran for the door, my old legs moving faster than they had in years. Adrenaline giving me strength I didn't know I still possessed. I could hear him cursing behind me as I fumbled with the door handle, his footsteps pounding across the porch. I made it inside and tried to slam the door, but he was too close, too strong. He shoved his way in, his face twisted with fury, no longer bothering to hide the monster he'd always been. I ran for the stairs, praying my heart wouldn't give out before I reached the bedroom, before I could get to Samuel's rifle. Jasper caught me halfway up, his hands grabbing at my nightgown. But I kicked back with desperate strength and felt my heel connect with something soft. He howled in pain and loosened his grip just enough for me to break free. The bedroom door slammed behind me, and I threw the lock, knowing it wouldn't hold him long. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely work the closet latch. But finally I had the rifle in my hands, the weight of it familiar and comforting. I could hear Jasper throwing himself against the door, the wood splintering with each impact. When the door finally gave way and he burst into the room, wild-eyed and dangerous, I was ready for him. The last thing I saw before I pulled the trigger was his face, shocked and disbelieving, as he realized that this time, his victim was going to fight back. The gunshot echoed through my bedroom like thunder, and for a moment everything went silent, except for the ringing in my ears. But when the smoke cleared, Jasper was still standing there, unhurt. And I realized with growing horror that Samuel's old rifle had misfired. The look on Jasper's face shifted from shock to cruel satisfaction as he stepped over the scattered remnants of my last hope. He was advancing toward me when we both heard it. Sirens wailing in the distance, getting closer. Tom Crawford and his team were coming, probably alerted by the recording device that had been transmitting everything. But they were still minutes away. And I could see in Jasper's eyes that he planned to finish this before they arrived. That's when I heard the voice that changed everything. Samuel's voice, calling from downstairs, as clear as if he'd never died at all. Jasper spun toward the sound, his face going white as a sheet. And I saw him mouth the word, "Daddy," like a lost child. The footsteps on the stairs were heavy, deliberate, unmistakably real. And when Samuel appeared in the doorway, alive and breathing, I thought my old heart might stop from pure shock. But it wasn't a ghost or a miracle. It was something far more devastating. Samuel looked at both of us with eyes full of disgust and disappointment, then explained what I was too stunned to comprehend. His death had been faked, part of an elaborate sting operation he'd been working on with the FBI for months. They'd known about Jasper's criminal activities, known he would come for me after the funeral, and Samuel had volunteered to help catch his own son in the act. Every moment of grief I'd suffered, every tear I'd shed over Samuel's grave, had been performance for an audience of one. The man I'd mourned and missed desperately had been watching from a safe house while I fell into his son's trap, letting me be seduced and violated because it served their investigation. Jasper broke down completely then, sobbing and begging his father for forgiveness. But Samuel's face remained stone cold. He told his son that watching him prey on me, the woman Samuel truly loved, had been the final confirmation that Jasper was beyond redemption. When the FBI agents flooded into the room to arrest Jasper, Samuel didn't even look at him. But he looked at me, and what I saw in his eyes wasn't love or regret. It was calculation. He explained that our marriage had been part of his cover all along, that he'd needed a wife who fit the profile of Jasper's victims to make the trap convincing. Even our wedding day, our years together, the love I thought we'd shared, all of it had been nothing but an elaborate lie. As they led Jasper away in handcuffs, he turned back to look at me one last time. In his eyes I saw something that chilled me more than his threats had. Pity. He pitied me for being fool enough to believe that anyone could love an old woman like me. The house fell silent after they all left, Samuel included. He'd served his purpose and had no more use for the widow he'd created. I sat in my rocking chair, surrounded by the wreckage of two different kinds of love that had both been lies, and realized that at 83 years old, I was finally learning what real strength looked like. It looks like surviving when everything you believed in turns to ash. It looks like finding the will to keep living when you discover that your entire life has been someone else's game. It looks like an old woman, alone in an empty house, choosing to keep breathing despite having every reason to give up. I learned that the heart can be broken twice by the same family, and still keep beating. I learned that betrayal comes in many forms, and sometimes the people who save you are the same ones who destroy you. But most importantly, I learned that even when love is a lie, the strength you find to survive it is real. If my story has taught you anything, let it be this. You are stronger than you know, braver than you believe, and worthy of love that doesn't come with conditions or ulterior motives. Don't let anyone make you feel grateful for crumbs when you deserve the whole feast. Subscribe to hear more stories from women who refused to be victims, who found their voices when the world tried to silence them. And tell me, what city are you watching from? I want to know that somewhere out there, someone understands that growing old doesn't mean growing weak, and that sometimes the most important fight of your life comes when you think all the fighting is done.